We have two very interesting sessions today. In the afternoon, first we move the focal point from interdisciplinarity towards the boundaries between science, politics, and society. We should have three presentations lined up in this session. However, we are still waiting for confirmation from Ms. Adrienn Király, who is the head of cabinet of European Commissioner Mariya Gabriel, and she hasn't locked on yet, as far as I understood. So I think what we are going to do is we're going to start with President Antonio Loprieno, who's the president of ALLEA, and he will start the discussions and give the first presentation, which will be titled Across Academic Boundaries in Science, Politics and Society. Please, Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, it's a distinct pleasure to address you this afternoon on a topic which is actually very much central to the activity of ALLEA as a network of academies, but perhaps of our scientific landscape as a whole on our continent right now. What I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes would be to give you an introduction to three different aspects that play a fundamental role in our activity as academies, which is, on the one hand, crossing scientific boundaries in the sense in which it was very well introduced this morning in all our presentations. The second is the role that the academies play in this interaction with society and politics at large. And the third, which is probably the most important strategic aspect, is that now, precisely at this present moment, it is a moment where academies probably have to play an even bigger and more important role than was the case in the past. What I like to do is to give you an introduction of I'm an historian by training, of how we came about to this situation. And I'd like to stress, so I'd like to start, of course, with the best way to start, which is with my own University of Basel. And it is by giving you a sense that a very central dialogue between academics and politics is not something we should be wary about or something we should disregard, but goes to the very core of European academies in their development. In fact, for the first 400 years of the development of European academic thinking, when academy was still very much synonym of university, the completeness of all the studies, we had a situation in which, on the one hand, academies conveyed a knowledge which was a combined knowledge, which was a circular, encyclopedic, transdisciplinary knowledge. On the other hand, this knowledge was very much embedded into a political and social reality. The function of the academies or of the university was to train the future elite in three particular areas, which were the three areas where that at that time were considered the higher faculties, that is theology, law, and medicine. The entire organization was thus very much political in the sense of training in a utilitarian perspective the future elite, but was not national in the sense that our predecessors already in the Middle Ages knew that science is transnational. And in fact, the quality of an academy in the sense of university was measured on the number of professors that would come from elsewhere to teach the local elite. So this interaction between local political needs and global scientific needs is very much at the center of the academic development. A major turn, and in fact, the birth of the academies, the way we understand it right now, that is of the academies of the type of the German Leopoldina or of the British Royal Society, is the 17th century. And it is precisely a time in which, in fact, universities are not any longer attractive scientific places because they have become very confessionalized, very much involved into the ideological war between Catholicism and Protestantism. So the new science, the empirical science, was emerging and found a new place to develop, and that was precisely the academy in the modern sense that would practice science, Wissenschaft in German, and not just knowledge, just encyclopedic knowledge. In this perspective, encyclopedia, what we will call transdisciplinarity, came to be identified with a dictionary, l'encyclopédie in the French tradition, which was actually a combination of all actually separated disciplines in a combined whole. So that is the origin, that the academies accompany the origin of interdisciplinarity in the sense of juxtaposition of different scientific scholarly perspectives. Now, the 19th century was a very important century in the discussion we are having, because in fact it changed the focus of attention of science from the academies to a new type of this distinction, academic in the adjective sense, that is to universities. And that was the time where actually three types of university understanding of disciplinary education came about. We can generally, it's very much summarized in this presentation, but we can generally say the Central European German, the more Anglo-Saxon model, and the more French model. In these traditions, the approach to disciplinary knowledge was very different, because in the German tradition, the university was an institution that actually was conceived to convey disciplinary competence. On the other hand, in the Anglo-Saxon, particularly after the Newman reform, the purpose of higher education was rather citizenship, was rather to provide a liberal general arts education, which would prepare for a future specialization at different levels. And again, in a third perspective, which was particularly emphasized in France in the 19th century and has come about until the modern time, the function of academic education is primarily to prepare to civil service, so professional accomplishment. These three different foci of attention, science in the disciplinary sense in the German tradition, citizenship as a societal good in the British tradition, and professional accomplishment in the tradition of the French hautes écoles, is something that accompanies the development of European academic thinking and disciplinary thinking over the 20th century, until we come to the situation we are experiencing right now. And the beginning of our current situation can be easily placed in the transformation of the European higher education and research area as a whole in the wake of the end of the Cold War, the creation of a common European higher education area from the 90s on, of which ALLEA is very much also an image and a mirror. Beginning with this time, so there has been a radical renegotiation, as scholars call it, of boundaries between disciplines, but also of boundaries between the disciplinary world, the academic world, and society and politics in the general frame. And I've summarized here three aspects in which in the last 20 years, we have seen an enormous transformation of what actually science is about in its connection with society. So we have an internal, institutional perspective in which universities have been asked to develop their own institutional strategies that for which they would receive political support, well, very much dependent also on serving, but also complying with the expectation of the political support that they needed in order to fulfill their societal function. That brought some restrictions, of course, on the autonomy of each disciplinary field. Institutional autonomy involves restrictions on disciplinary autonomy. On the other hand, there has also been a development in science itself. We have all experienced that the very understanding of Wissenschaft, and I use here on purpose the German term, because as we all know, science in English in the proper sense is actually empirical science, it's more natural or life sciences, whereas I refer to the scientific endeavor as a whole, has become very much also oriented towards quantitatively measurable research, which would become a proxy of precisely this institutional autonomy that was very much in the center of attention. So the disciplinary boundaries in this perspective are very much challenged by the emergence of global challenges, and particularly now, of course, the challenges of the digital transformation. And finally, there has been an increased attention in our socio-political discourse, but also in academic discourse, on the dialogue, on the embeddedness of our scientific endeavor in economy and socio-economical activities as a whole. The emergence of the concept of ecosystem. In this institutional turn, we have to admit, and so it's important if we want to do something also as academies, to start by understanding where perhaps we have not yet performed what we should have. I think we have not yet performed as we should have as academies in responding to this institutional turn. So universities have been quicker or swifter than European academies in adapting to these changed expectations of the political elite. At the center, so we have, so to say, a new function, what is called a new mission of science in general, which is so from an internal scientific point of view to respond to the urgent challenges that we have. On the other hand, we to respond to the expectation of the productive sector, so open, what is called open innovation, in the interest of the ecosystem of this ideal combination of the contribution of science to society that we all strive for, and that we, not only as scientists, but also as citizens, we should be interested in. While we used to have a concept such as university or the adjective academic, which was pretty much the same all over the continent in earlier years, now we have a variety of institutional, we call them profiles. We have very different types of universities that respond in different ways to the need to have or to stress scientific excellence, or to be attentive to the economic impact, because obviously an institution cannot do everything, has to make some particular choices, in particular looking at the success of innovation, if we understand innovation as the combination of scientific excellence and possible impact on society. And in this respect, again, I come back to an observation that I made before. Academies have localized themselves very much for obvious historical reasons on the axis of scientific excellence, have been perhaps less attentive to the impact on society, not only economic, but perhaps also to the overall, let's say, response to scientific progress that we find in societies. And this is something where we probably need to work out. This morning, we had this excellent presentation by our colleague Rita Hari, where in fact, so some of the things that I'm going to summarize right now were presented in much more elegant way, but the result or the gist of this slide is actually that our received forms of disciplinary education are now being challenged for all the reasons, for all the evolutions that I tried to describe very quickly before, are now being radically challenged, so that you have a variety of curricular possibilities of combining disciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary perspectives. So this of course represents a challenge for our academic institution that of course have to respond to specific needs, should not represent, in my opinion, a challenge for our academies, because in the wake of the 19th centuries, the academies that used to be, as we saw before, actually transdisciplinary by definition, have had a tendency to diversify into disciplinary sectors. And my personal impression is that the time of the disciplinary sectors for the academic endeavor, especially in view of this interaction with science and politics, it may be probably over, and that in fact it is the academic endeavor as a whole that should come to the center of our attention. And this is why, by the way, this type of automatic move towards transdisciplinarity is the reason why, for good reasons, our political stakeholders and generally our societal stakeholders are very much interested in our transdisciplinary activity. They are very much interested in transdisciplinarity because this is the level at the intersection, if you will, of all sciences with the governance aspect, that is, with the interest of society as a whole. And as such, we should not be surprised, as it were, that precisely in a period of institutional autonomy, our societal and political stakeholders expect a particular drive towards transdisciplinary orientation on the side of academic actors such as we are. The idea of stakeholders plays a particular role here, both stakeholders from political and from policy and civil societies, and stakeholders in the sense of the overall governmental structure. And to perhaps document this in the best way, in fact, we can base ourselves on the experience that we have been having so far, unfortunate in many respects, but we are still having now with the current pandemic. And here we have to say, as scientists, and we have to admit that science is certainly not the aspect of society that has suffered the most under the pandemic. Probably it's one of the arms of society that has benefited from this pandemic, in the sense that probably more than in the past, the importance of science and science advice has been at the center even of political attention. So this has expedited, as it were, this has increased the necessity on the side of academies to provide expert information for decision making at the policy level. I have here the example of our task force in my own country, in Switzerland, but I am absolutely positive that the example I'm giving for rapidity reason of Switzerland can be transposed to vary, if not the majority, if not the totality of European countries in dealing with this pandemic, and even extra-European countries. There has always been the need to be quickly, to mobilize quickly a certain number of experts, and our academies are, by definition, to say, the best place where to look for address for experts, and to embed them into a science advice mechanism that would provide general orientation for our community, for our citizenship as a whole. And we can see this at the local level, and I can say also at the global political level. In fact, the European Union right now is considering putting together an advisory group very much with the help of European academies, an advisory group on preparedness to crisis. How should European institutions as a whole react to crisis? So lessons learned, as it were, from the pandemic that can be so generalized to any type of particular crisis that might affect our societies. So allow me to conclude with a forecast. And the forecast is, of course, I wouldn't be doing my job if this forecast wasn't positive for the academies. And in fact, the forecast is that one disadvantage in our historical development may turn out at the present time to be precisely a competitive advantage. And that is the fact that we have been, as academies, less involved in the institutional profiling, in the institutional transformation that has affected European academic institutions in the in the sense of universities in the last 20 years. So in view of a double evolution, we may be, because of our flexibility, we might be more reactive to this science politics, science society dialogue, and to be more able to cross these boundaries. The first evolution is an ever increasing specialization of science. Obviously, the best results of science are those that are reached within a particular specialization in disciplinary competence. On the other hand, a transdisciplinary collaboration to solve the overall problems of science and the role it has to play in society and in policy advice as a whole. So we have to deal with what I might call, or we might all call, a hybridization of science. We used to be linked to this very, let me just formulate it perhaps, ivory tower understanding of what we were doing, and we are all becoming hybrids of sorts. Not only hybrids right now because of this interaction, digital versus analog, but also hybrid in the form of crossing boundaries between scientific discourse in the proper internal endogamic sense and crossing interaction, cross-fertilization with society and politics, particularly, but not only, but particularly in times of crisis. And this is something where I think our European academies, with all their accumulated know-how and with this increased experience in dealing with the difficulty of conveying institutional, disciplinary variety into proper policy making, this is something where we might actually be successful in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for that inspiring and backward-looking presentation where we got to look into the history of academies and universities, and this is something that gives us very much a perspective, and it's very helpful for us thinking about the way forward. And especially I thank you for the call to action for all national academies. This is something very important, and to all academies across Europe, we would like to say from Finland that in Finland we have had a science advice initiative, an experimental initiative for the past 3 years, which has been kindly seed funded by the Ministry of Education and Culture, where we try to explore new modes of delivering science advice. And this is something that we consider very important, and this is also something that we would like to have a dialogue with any academies around Europe that are thinking even to whether they should engage in such activities or not. We would very much like to work in collaboration, because this is something where we need to be working as a collective intelligence network. So thanks very much, Antonio, for that. Our next speaker comes from Brussels, I believe. At least there's a European Union flag behind. So she's Ms. Adrienn Király, who's the head of cabinet of European Commissioner Mariya Gabriel. Adrienn, we're very happy to see you online. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a pleasure for me to be addressing the European Federation of Academic Sciences and Humanities and the Council of Finnish Academies today on the occasion of the Symposium Across the Boundaries of Science on behalf of Commissioner Mariya Gabriel. COVID-19 is unfortunately still with us and still reminding us more than ever that scientific evidence is essential and it is really in high demand. Scientists and policymakers need to work closer together to deliver progress for our societies and to tackle the current challenges that are faced by our economies and our planet. For the last 60 years, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission has been working at the interface of science and policy. Collaboration is essential in this challenging task because research cannot be done in a lab and in isolation. Like COVID-19, climate change and financial collapse does not respect national or physical borders. This is why the European Commission collaborates at all levels with a number of academic and national institutions. And we are eager to intensify our dialogue with networks like ALLEA inside and outside Europe. Nowadays, information and data from various sources overload us. A vast amount of information needs to be collected, analyzed, and presented to policymakers in a way that can inform the policy process. To facilitate the process of delivering scientific evidence, we need to develop special skills for scientific knowledge brokers. I would like to quote the president of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, Professor Dan Larhammar, in the capacity as the chair of ALLEA's project, Fact or Fake, Tackling Science Disinformation. He defines science disinformation as a term used not only for different types of distortion of scientific facts, but also attacks on science in order to undermine trust. This can occur by spreading contradictory information, weaving conspiracy theories, questioning expertise, or spreading false rumors about science and scientists. We agree with this definition. During the COVID-19 crisis, the media analysis toolkit developed by the Joint Research Center has picked up a daily average of nearly 3,000 articles on COVID-19 coming from the so-called unverified sources. Whilst not all of these may be mis or disinformation, it is probable that a high proportion are intended to fuel public fear and anger during the crisis. While trust in scientists is generally high, an erosion in the authority of science on specific topics makes it harder to solve broader issues. And we are witnessing this every day with the climate crisis, for example. So to accurately evaluate the concept of trust in science, we need to consider not only you, the scientists, but also the scientific method, scientific organizations, and more widely, science as a social system. The fight against disinformation and fake news has become a cornerstone of our strategy to overcome the health and social emergencies. Already in June last year, the European Commission adopted a communication tackling COVID-19 disinformation. Trust and distrust in scientific expertise is largely patterned by socioeconomic, political, cultural, and psychological factors. Living conditions and social inequality, political systems, historic and cultural legacies, individual emotions, all this can influence the dynamics of trust. In face of science skepticism in parts of the population, we need to promote research that is open, responsible towards society, involving citizens in setting the research and innovation priorities and co-designing its outcomes. Science needs to be conducted in a transparent way, with scientists adhering to the highest standards of integrity and ethical conduct. ALLEA has been very vocal about this need with its European Conduct for Research Integrity. In our responses, we must remember that the trustworthiness is not only about competence and excellence in science. People are sensitive to both expertise and honesty of information sources. The corona crisis has instilled in our societies the virus of fear. Therefore, building trust is also part of containing the pandemic. At the time when the world is looking at you, the scientific community to help solve the complex issues of our age, this is an additional burden. And it is one that we will only be successful if we allow intellectual humanity and humility to prevail. We must refute, debunk, and set the record straight with accuracy, empathy, and compassion. In the complex online information environment, the case for science, evidence, and expertise had to be argued on the political as well as the scientific grounds. We in the European Commission will do our part of the work, and I encourage you to do yours. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Adrienn, and it was a pleasure to hear you speak, and we very much appreciate of the many of the pioneering work that is done around in the European Commission and European Union on these topics, and especially so like JRC and SAPEA and some are doing some very pioneering good work in rethinking the scientific policy interface. So we do hope to see that work continue and strong support for this work in the future as well. So thank you for joining us today and all the best to your work in Brussels. So our next and final speaker of the session will be Permanent Secretary Anita Lehikoinen from the Ministry of Education and Culture here in Finland, just a few blocks from here. She will be talking about reflections on strengthening ties between science and politics. Please, Anita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And very good afternoon from here in Helsinki. It is really a big honor and great pleasure to be here and to share some ideas with you. As you probably can guess, I'm not the Minister of Science and Culture, Annika Saarikko, but I bring her warmest regards to you. And I think she has a very good cause or reason not to attend this meeting and this very important occasion. She's actually taking part in the first debate on the education and research or science policy white paper in our parliament as we speak. And this is also a very rare occasion because the latest white paper or report on education policy was made in 2006. And if we take into account all the mega trends shaping societies and the world at large, I think it is high time that the government gave this kind of white paper. And why do I start my speech talking about education policy? And this is something I think that is very essential to address when we talk about research and science policy and the interaction between politicians and researchers or academia and the rest of society. Well, we think, of course, when we prepared for this white paper on education and science and research policy, we thought that there are such big challenges that can't be successfully solved if we don't address these questions on how to deliver high-quality education, how to make it more admissible, and also how can we make sure that we have high-quality scientific research to make sure that we are doing the right things to solve these global problems, and how to make sure that we can address them at all levels, at local level, at national level, and at international level. And here we have to take into account the whole knowledge triangle. I think we in Finland, we talked about knowledge triangle before the whole concept was introduced, because we see that educating the whole population, I suppose it is because of the small number of our people, we have always believed that we have to educate the whole population, and also to some extent, I think this serves the purpose of science and research so that it can serve society. I very much enjoyed the address by your president, because that really inspired a few thoughts, and I could also recognize that this is exactly what he described happened to universities in the 1990s that we did in Finland. But education, research or science and innovation, those are the things that we normally talk about when we try to talk about science. And this, I think, is remarkable, and I will say a few words why that might be so. Well, first of all, still going back to why we have this white paper on education and research or science policy now, because it has to do with the fact whether we really base our policy making, policy formulations on evidence, on science, on research. And I would say that being very frank here, that we do not act as we teach. Because there had been very many reports, papers at national level, at the international level, which clearly showed that we are not as good in our educational attainment or the equity and equal opportunities policies as we think that we have been. And we have been really working on these issues at the ministry for quite a few years, but there was not this kind of, the message was not well received among decision makers. Some would say that there was the kind of classical, even data denial, because it was a very difficult message to get through and to say that probably this is true as the research shows the results. So there was no sense of urgency to do anything with the education because we are the leaders of education and the results have been good if we compare them in international terms. And then why do we not talk about science policy? I think it is fair to say that at least here in Finland we have been a little bit shy to talk about science policy. We combine it with education and these letters R and D and I. And at this very moment there's a heated debate is going on among our people at large, perhaps not so large, but within scientific community, that we do not stress enough the importance of science, but we give more room to education, higher education policies, and to development and to innovation. And why is it so difficult to talk about research and science policies? And I think there are very sort of, how would I put it, very easy solutions to it to some extent. Sometimes I think that there is perhaps some kind of mistrust between the politicians and researchers. And sometimes it seems to me, and I've been working at the ministry for the past 30 years, and sometimes it seems to be that there is a lack of appreciation, mutual appreciation and respect. And sometimes we can see that when we have new decision makers, they are a little bit afraid of addressing famous, high-quality researchers. And this is a pity, I think. And this is something that we have to acknowledge, we have to recognize this kind of situation, and then find paths or avenues how to come away from this situation. There was also in the President's presentation mentioning about these drivers of change or forces behind different fields of policies. And when we think about the different dynamics and logics in the world of politics and policy formulation, and in the academia, we can see that they are very, very different. And I think that every now and then, perhaps it would need to be a constant reflection, what are the different dynamics? And of course then, the cycle of impact and results, it's very, very different. In most of our countries, there are parliamentary or national elections every 4 years, and then there are local elections in between. And our politicians, they are there to serve the population, and they are there to serve their local needs. And when there is a big discussion of the needs of science and research at global level or at EU level, you can't be sure that these goals are shared at the local level. And the politicians, when they flourish, the voters vote, and when researchers flourish, their peers value them, and the individual researchers and researcher groups are able to pursue their curiosity-driven research, or then they find also some attractive and perhaps well-funded international projects. And I think this is something that we all know and we all recognize it, but I think it would have to be said aloud often enough so that all stakeholders understand this difference. And then about the agenda setting. I think this is one of the biggest duties and the kind of points of impact research and science can make to society and has actually made. We talk about climate change, and we have actually a very ambitious coalition program in this sense. Some argue that it is the most ambitious program, and the political goals are at a very high level. And of course, this was put on the agenda of the global scientific community. And it took decades before it was taken that probably they know what they are talking about and we should do something. And now I think this is a good example how we can actually let the science set the agenda, but we should also make sure that it wouldn't have to take decades, because there are urgent needs in our societies all over the globe, and we have these planetary problems that we can solve only through science. And of course, the most obvious example is now the coronavirus pandemic. There has been in many countries huge outcry, why don't we have the vaccinations now? Why didn't we have them already in the autumn? And usually, as we all know, it takes years and years before we have vaccinations for new diseases. And then whether it was the massive amount of new resources put into research, into vaccination development, or whether we can see that it was actually those roots that were there for a long time. So there had been wise investments in a basic or fundamental research, and then we could build on them, those results, and that's why we had this huge success, unfortunately only in the rich countries, and not in all of them either, to hold back the pandemic. But there we have to see that it takes a long time before we get results that are then applied through society. And perhaps this is also something that we still need to clarify between these two worlds or spheres of social policies. In a society based on equity and equal opportunities like Finland, sometimes it is very difficult to make this point that we have to make choices at the highest possible level when we are reaching to the top of the world in the quality of research. And we have been trying to solve this, that we say that we have to have a very rich and a very varied and diverse garden of all kinds of flowers and plants, so that we can then pick the most flourishing, the most beautiful flowers. But you can't pick first and expect that then you have the big results. So you have the wide kind of equity-based basis for everything, for education, for science and research, and then you can make your choices, and not to pick the winners, but make them flourish that then could benefit the society and the economy at large. And I think this is something that we need to discuss also between the two spheres. And of course we need very different kinds of tools and funding mechanisms for different kinds of impacts we are awaiting from research and from science community, from universities. And when we support all of them at local level, you have different kinds of goals. You want to perhaps address the kind of local or regional needs for development, for employment and economic development, but then you have a different sets of tools to address the highest level of science excellence. And this is also sometimes very difficult to address when you talk between politicians and researchers. And sometimes I think what helps usually when you have a lack of communication or failure of communication, then you have to take time to discuss and to listen. And is it really quite telling that usually when you have meetings and you are expecting many people to attend, and you find that many people can't attend those important meetings because lack of time. And sometimes when we have tried to organize roundtables between researchers and political decision makers, and then you don't succeed, and they say they lack time, then the question to be asked really is that are we each other's most important stakeholders? And do we feel the urgent need to pass the message through the walls, be it academia or society at large, or the world of politics and policy formulation? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I was very pleased to be given this kind of title, Reflections, because it means that I can really reflect on my experience working for the government, but also working with higher education and research with universities for a long time here in Finland. And I would like to conclude by saying that we can't expect fruitful discussion or interaction between politics, policy formulation and academia, science, if we do not acknowledge the importance of freedom of science and the autonomy of all universities and all academic organizations. This is very important. And I think these days we have lots of global problems to solve, but one that we don't address too often is the importance of freedom of research, freedom of express, and safeguarding our democratic societies. This is a kind of mission I would like to see our research and science community to work with political decision makers. Thank you very much, and all the best in your most important work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita. So we have some time still left, and I see that Antonio is still online. And so, Antonio, would you like to reflect on what Anita said, just on the top of your head, what came to your mind?
Well, thank you very much, so Permanent Secretary Lehikoinen, for these reflections, which are in fact, if I read them as a representative of the academies, which are both a sign of a compliment to our academies and to our work, so the importance of which you stressed very much in your wonderful presentation. On the other hand, also in a very elegant way, you also suggested some avenues in which we might still have food for thought, and we still have some work to do ahead of us. In particular, I'd like to reflect on one issue, which is the one that you mentioned on the very correct autonomy of science and of scientific discourse, particularly in dealing with the political instances. And there I would like to share with you perhaps also a difficulty that we experience now precisely in the wake of this institutional turn I was talking about. Because what is the autonomy of each single scientist may not be the autonomy of the institution behind this single scientist. And this is something that I was referring to at the end when I said that there's here perhaps a chance for the academies. Because precisely in times of crisis, we have had even a quite open discussion in Switzerland on this issue. The political world, and to a certain extent, also society at large, expect science to speak with one voice. And that is an absolutely legitimate expectation, especially in view of the urgent challenges that you very correctly refer to. The problem from the point of view of science is that there is no one voice in science. Science is always temporary, is always provisional, is always trying to mediate between the empirical evidence and the overall requirements of the context within which we operate. And this may be also a little bit of a challenge for scientists right now, more than perhaps in the past, precisely because of this very positive, more increased interaction with society at large and with the political representatives that you were describing so forcefully. So this is both good news, of course, for us as scientists, but it's also homework for us, because we need perhaps to develop a strategy which we haven't been able to develop in the 300 years in which science in the modern sense, or 400 years, which science in the modern sense has been around. We haven't really been able to really deal with a correct translation of the variety of scientific options into productive social political discourse. This is something that we need also to be perhaps in the challenge of this great digital transformation. We need to become more adequate and more skilled in. The danger is, of course, that that society at large or politicians misinterpret scientific debate between comparably legitimate positions and fake news. And there is a very clear divide, and it's not always easy, and we need to be a little bit better in making this big divide between legitimate, scholarly, interdisciplinarily open discourse and out of the blue fake news. We need to make it more clear, also in the interest of society we want to serve.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Loprieno. I would like to reflect on one point because I've been thinking about this for a long time. It's really quite a inclusive and even, is it on? Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Loprieno. Very good speech, and thank you for the nice comments. One point I would like to still reflect on. When we did this very big university reform 2010, it came into force. And we were very happy at the ministry, and we thought that we are now serving the universities better. And I remember I was so surprised when I went to the University of Helsinki, the big hall, and I said that here you have it, the autonomy as you pre-ordered. And then one of the professors stood up and said that, look, you don't understand that university is an institution, it's not an organization. And that was so valuable for me, that comment, because it really set light just on this, what you were saying, that we always expect that when we address the scientific community, that we get a clear answer, and that people should talk in one voice, and they should feel free and autonomous within the autonomous university. And then to realize that people, individuals, they belong much more to international scientific community. They are there not to serve their university's strategy, which we expect them to do and follow, and we reward them if this strategy is good. And this is something, it's very, very difficult, especially I think in countries like Finland, where most of the universities work on public money. They get most of the core funding from the Ministry of Education and Culture, and then the competed funding through the Academy of Finland, public money, or Business Finland, public money again. So the share of private funding for our universities is very, very small. So there is a kind of tendency in the politicians to expect service to the country. And this is always this dilemma on our hands. But I think it's fascinating discussion, and I think that there is still room for discussion. We didn't empty this, and I'll be happy to come back to these issues with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita, and I'd also like to raise a point that you brought up about agenda setting, and I think that's a very important and sometimes actually underappreciated and underemphasized in that what is important in the scientific community and scientific research is how tremendous impact it does through agenda setting, because sometimes we focus, especially in science and policy, we focus on the daily political issues and these debates, and to use a hyperbole, you might say that scientific evidence comes to Parliament to die, but there's a nugget of truth there, that actually the more politically contentious an issue is, then that's the downstream of policy and scientific information, scientific research doesn't have necessarily as much impact. However, in the agenda setting phase, it has much more, and I think that there is also a lot of influence that is being done by the scientific community towards policymakers in the agenda setting phase, and that's something that it's good to just recognize and bring up explicitly. So that's why I wanted to brought up the point. I think we also have a comment from Professor Anna Mauranen, who wanted to join the conversation. We still have a little bit of time, so please, Anna.
Right. Can you hear me? Yep. I just wanted to make a quick comment which relates to your conversation, and it is that, yes, it is quite common for people to expect scientific communities to speak with one voice, but conversely, nobody expects the political community to speak with one voice. And my question that I would like to raise is, why is this the case? I mean, I'm sure that we all understand that we are individuals, we are groups, we are groupings, and we all have our different levels of agendas. So, if you can answer this one, I would be extremely grateful. Thank you.
Well, if I may try, my luck, with some kind of an historical, perhaps, explanation. And I think, Anna, that the reason for this very interesting divorce of expectation that you are so eloquently describing is actually contained in this very first slide that I presented. And you remember, in the University of Basel, but I have to say, so in many other medieval universities would have been the same. The idea that the community represented there was one professor and a couple of students. All of them males, unfortunately, at that time, now a little bit more diverse. But yet the message is the same. The Science Academy has traditionally presented itself as a community, has presented itself as one, so to say, so I won't say family, but certainly as a republic of more or less equally inclined individuals. Let's not forget that academies until very recently were also indeed autonomous republics from a political point of view. The rector of a university was also a judge who was able to put the students and the professors to prison if they misbehaved. When I was a rector, I would have very much liked to have this privilege, but unfortunately, Swiss rule had changed already at that time. It was already in the 21st century, but things had, even in Switzerland, already changed in that respect. And so whereas the political arena has always been perceived in our Western liberal democracies precisely as characterized by multi-faceted opinions. And thus, I would say that in our common culture, in our common socio-political expectations, the idea is that communities operate within one internal logic. And the internal logic is the logic of unity. And scientists, our world is viewed as a Gemeinschaft, as one says in German, in this respect. Whereas the political life is viewed as an arena, is viewed as a kind of stadium of competitiveness. So you have what Permanent Secretary Lehikoinen mentioned before, the reaction of this professor of the University of Helsinki, who said, let's not forget universities are institutions and not organizations. Well, I would slightly correct this insightful opinion by my colleague and say, yes, indeed, universities were institutions. But right now, because of a form of institutional transformation that is taking place, among other things, thanks to the autonomy, they are becoming more and more organizations because they need to cater to their political and social stakeholders in order to be adequately funded. You cannot expect money just for free. And that transforms something that was originally an institution with a community, with the expectation of one basic opinion, into an organization with a variety of foci of interest and also of positions.
Thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you, Permanent Secretary Lehikoinen, and thank you, Adrienn Király, who's already left. It's a good start of a lot of thoughts and a lot of topics that we could spend all day on. So very much appreciate everyone, participants, for all the food for thought and your views. And now it's time for a coffee break.